you do have to get those early interventions in. You can't wait forever. There's different types of dyslexia, and looking at the sort of challenges that your child has gives you an idea of what type of dyslexia. For Harry, it was very much a phonological. He just couldn't hear those vowel sounds, and that's where we started. Pressure is a killer as well. Just to feel under pressure really makes them want to back off. Achieving success in things that they can do, so that keeps their self-esteem up, because self-esteem is the biggie.
Beth Beamish is the author of Dyslexia, Wrestling with an Octopus. In this book, you're so incredibly vulnerable and warm, and you share all of your experience with supporting your son Harry with dyslexia, as well as your own personal discovery of having dyslexia yourself. And reading it, as you put it in the book, it really does feel like you're talking to another parent that you ran into at school pickup. But I feel like what makes it different is that you're not just an empathetic shoulder to lean on. You have real, practical, researched strategies, and you explain the terminology in a really clear, visual way. It's not overwhelming, and the empathy that you have in the book is genuine because you've been through all of this yourself. So I'm so glad to have you here. Thank you for taking the time. So let's start with the book titled. I love this as a metaphor, and I love visuals just like you. So can you explain how they represent the different parts of dyslexia and why you chose that as an image or an image at all to help parents understand what it feels like when your child has dyslexia?
Right, well, there's a lot in there, Kate, but I'd say hi. I'm actually just thrilled that you asked me to be on your podcast because, yeah, I always wanted to do a podcast, but I just knew I wouldn't cope trying to pull it all together. So it's fantastic to get this opportunity to chat on yours. Well done. And yeah, I'm glad you found my book helpful. There is this sort of whole imposter thing that I had going on of like, who am I to tell anybody about dyslexia? But I just did want to share, having had to learn so much. My son's actually got multiple learning challenges, not just dyslexia, and I had to really skill up a huge amount. And I did want to sort of, rather than just throw all that information away, pass it on to see if it would help somebody else. So I'm so pleased it did help you. I'm really pleased about that. So let me show you my octopus. He's big. He's big. Yay. And
I love
I
it.
kind of came up with the idea of an octopus because I love mind maps. I love infographics. I think having dyslexia, often it's easier to gather information from pictures. I just found it really helpful actually having a mind map. So I was starting to sort of draw a mind map of what's dyslexia. And then I thought, oh, there's 8 aspects. Well, what's got 8? Oh, an octopus. And it kind of all clicked together. So I did these arms of the octopus as being the 8 areas of challenge that somebody with dyslexia might have. Now, you don't have to have all 8. Some of them I would say I was very mildly challenged in, but, a lot of people will have all 8. So I don't want to go through all 8 of them because that would probably take up the rest of the podcast.
Yeah.
But I'll just give you an example of 1 or 2. So you could have one arm being, for example, it could be something like reading and the challenges of reading. Now, interestingly, I didn't know I was dyslexic when I was at school because reading was never really a problem for me. But it's only later in life that I've realized, oh, so I don't read like everybody else. I'm a very slow reader. I can read, and I've never, I read books all the time, but it's not speed reading by any chance. It's reading the same speed that I speak, basically. So, but also within that reading arm, you've got things like print blurring or phonological issues. It's more than just reading. There's lots more going on with reading. And then another arm, for example, might be motor control problems. And what that would be is things like, tying shoelaces, learning to swim, learning to ride a bike. Things that you would think, oh, what's that got to do with dyslexia? Well, actually, it is all part of it. And I was really the whole swimming thing was hilarious because my daughter was like a little fish, no problem, throw her in swimming lessons and she was away. And I took my son swimming at the same age, and it was an absolute disaster. I paid for a private individual lesson from absolute disaster. And then we came back to it later and he became the school swimming champion. He just wasn't
Mm-hmm.
ready for it, and for him, he couldn't cross over. The brain wasn't ready for that crossing over. So it's really interesting
Yeah.
that that was actually an aspect of dyslexia for him as well. So yeah, we've got
Mm-hmm.
various problems, and on my Octopus, I use each arm to talk about these different aspects of dyslexia.
I like that because I've experienced. I've talked to some friends who were kind of discovering these different arms separately and thinking, I mean, it has to all come together. It can't just all be one big coincidence. So
Yeah,
I like
yeah.
that they are separate things, but they all kind of fall under the same umbrella. You said you kind of had a light bulb moment while you were helping him. So what was that recognition process like for you as an adult? And, how is knowing that helped you as an adult?
Well, um, yeah, it is interesting. As I say, I was in my 40s when I discovered that I had dyslexia. Back in the 70s and 80s, to have any neurological difference was just, you wouldn't be talking about that. And it was actually just a huge shame, and the shame that comes with having a learning challenge was really big for me. It was something I felt I just was dumb. I think basically, I can remember being in my primary school class and thinking, how does everybody else know the order of these letters in the alphabet? How do they get that? Um, and it
Mhm.
was really interesting, those middle letters, LMNOP, whew, I couldn't get those for a
Yeah.
long, long time. Um, and the idea of ordering things and filing throughout my life, that's just been an absolute nightmare. But I didn't know it was dyslexia. I just thought I was a bit dumb, really. And so it was interesting when I started to work with Harry, my son, going, oh, so there's actually a name for this. Oh, look at that. Even I mention in the book, when it comes to cooking, it is a bomb site in my kitchen because that whole sequence that you have to do to cook. Really, I've always struggled with that. I'm not great at multitasking. And actually, there's a technical term for it. And it is all part of that executive function that is a problem when you've got dyslexia. So it was
Mhm.
actually quite a relief in some ways to go, oh, look at that. I'm not just hopeless. I've actually got dyslexia. And I found that really helpful. Especially, I think. For me, I definitely did have that mantle of shame. I did
Mhm.
feel I was a lesser person because I struggled with these things. But then when I started to see all these amazing people who have dyslexia, I was like, oh, well, that's quite special, actually. It's not
Mhm.
something to be ashamed of. It's just a different way of thinking. And that did help me quite a lot. Mm. So yeah, it all
Y-
happened really around the time I was helping Harry with his with his learning. And as I mentioned in the book, it actually came up at a Dr. Seuss exhibition where he had this bird with a funny hat on, and the title of that was "Fooling Nobody." And I just sort of really got that light bulb moment of I'm trying to project one image of who I am, but that's actually not who I am, and I'm fooling nobody. I just need to embrace it and go, yeah, I've got dyslexia. It's not a big thing, and this is just who I am. Yeah.
That's beautiful and empowering too.
Hmm.
I've noticed that with my daughter, telling her I read a book, and on the cover, the author said that she was a teacher and she's has dyslexia, and my daughter, paused for a second, and said, "Oh, but she has dyslexia," and I realized I had made a huge mistake in not explaining that. Yes, of course you can be a teacher if you have dyslexia. You can be anything, and it's not to do with intelligence. It's just the
Mm,
way that your brain
mm.
works.
Absolutely. And
That's
that whole thing of it's not to do with intelligence. The number of
Yes.
times people have said to me, oh, well, they can't have dyslexia because they're so intelligent. that
Mhm.
just breaks your heart, doesn't it? You know, the fact that people still have this impression that to be dyslexic means you are low IQ, which is just the
Mhm.
furthest thing from the truth. It's really
Mhm.
heartbreaking.
You named your chapters in the book after Dr. Seuss books. One of the chapters that I really loved is called Bunches of Hunches. And it really captures how parents often feel navigating this journey. What would you tell parents that are listening if they're hearing things like, oh, this is nothing to worry about? You know, you mentioned like riding a bike or swimming. That is something that maybe they need more time, but reading is not. And so, I heard in pre-K, and even in kindergarten, all the signs really were there. I wasn't
Mm.
educated enough in this to really know, and the teachers were saying, oh, nothing to worry about. So what would you tell parents about kind of trusting those hunches and maybe what
Mm.
they can do about it?
Well, it is difficult. If you don't know anybody in your family who's got dyslexia, you probably aren't looking for it. And in my situation, my child was adopted, so we didn't have a biological connection. So just because I have dyslexia wasn't going to impact him. So yeah, there was no reason for me to suspect that he might have dyslexia, and yet certainly right from being in kindergarten, he couldn't recognize letters. And he didn't recognize his name, short name though it was. He never recognized that. I do list a few other things in the book. I'll just have to look at my notes to get these ones. So for him, he did talk
Mhm.
late, and that's quite a common sign. And people will say, oh, it's just because they're not the oldest
Mhm.
and other children will talk for them. That might be the case in some children. But for my
Mhm.
child, he was saying nad, nad. And he used to just say that for everything, really. And I thought, well, that's really odd. You know, he doesn't really talk very clearly. And the words that he did say, he would often mispronounce. He would say tutu train, and we would say choo choo train. And just things like this. He really struggled to actually hear what the sounds were. So he had a bit of a speech impediment. He wasn't stuttering, but he definitely did have a speech impediment. He also, when he
Mhm.
was a baby, had a squint. And again, it's that hunches of bunches thing. You kind of think, oh, what's that got to do with
Mhm.
dyslexia? But actually, to read, you need your eyes to work together. It's a thing called eye tracking. And
Mhm.
when you've had a squint as a baby, your eyes don't track together. You haven't got a lead eye, and you do need a lead eye to read. So
Mhm.
even if the squint has resolved itself, which Harry's had by the time he'd gone to school, his eyes didn't track. They fought against each other, which was a real problem. He also had frequent
Mhm.
ear infections. Um, every tooth he cut basically got an ear infection. And he had a lot of antibiotics because of that, which was just a disaster for him. He really struggled to learn the names of shapes and colors. He struggled with sequencing. He'd jump out of bed and go, "What's for dinner, Mum?" And, that whole idea you'd have breakfast first and then lunch and then dinner,
Yeah.
just couldn't get that. He had no concept of days of the week and the weekend. Um, Actually, I can remember a friend of mine over the road whose son had dyslexia, and he would always call his dad Mum. And the dad obviously just got really cross. I'm not your mum, I'm your dad. But it's that sequencing
Mhm.
and labeling and naming things. So yeah, just those fine motor skills I mentioned, like tying shoelaces or struggling to
Mhm.
swim or ride a bike. They're all kind of early signs. Not that any one of them you would say, oh, my son can't ride a bike, therefore he's got dyslexia. But, you
Right.
get this bigger picture of what's going on, really.
Yes.
And in terms of what you can do about it, you do need to tread quite carefully. It is really hard as a parent, and it sounds like you've had the same issues that I have. If you go to the teachers and you go, oh, I'm really worried about, and they go, oh, don't worry about it. All do their own thing at their own time and don't worry about it at all.
Mhm.
So you kind of have to just keep questioning carefully.
Mhm.
You do have to get those early interventions in. You can't wait forever. We did reading recovery for Harry, which basically I think I mentioned in the book was just shouting louder at a deaf person because it hadn't worked the
Right.
first time and it wasn't going to
Yeah.
work this time. So that was really, really difficult. But what we had to start with for Harry was speech therapy because he
Mhm.
actually couldn't hear the vowel sounds. It was interesting. We'd go, k, a, t. Could that word be? What's that? And he would go, boat, house,
Yeah.
aeroplane. He literally couldn't hear the connection. So a bit of speech therapy was where we started with him, and that made a difference. But I do mention in the book that there's different types of dyslexia, and looking at the sort of challenges that your child has gives you an idea of what type of dyslexia. For Harry, it was very much a phonological. He just couldn't hear those vowel sounds, and that's where we started for him.
You're touching on something that is a key part of dyslexia, that is the phonemes. And it took me like 2 years to understand what the heck a phoneme was. So, can you explain to parents just the phoneme is just the sound? It's the sound. It has nothing to do with the letters. It's hearing.
Yeah, well, it's really interesting. I'm in a new country here. I live in New Zealand, and the people who lived in New Zealand before European colonial settlers came in were the Maori. Now, they didn't have a written language. So Maori was speaking to each other, communicating, and then in 1840, 1850, people came in and went, oh, let's write your language down. So actually, it kind of makes me realize that this whole thing of writing a language down, it's quite a new construct, really.
Hmm.
People were getting by quite happily without having to write their language down. And it's only because we're trying to get these children to go, okay, so now what you have to do is, you know how we talk to you and you understand us perfectly well and you can talk to us perfectly well. Now what we have to do is make that into scribbles on a page that you can decode and work out what that word is. And it is just such a strange concept, really, isn't it, when you think about it? So a phonogram is the visual symbol used to represent speech, such as a letter like T or CH. And the phoneme is the single sound, okay? So in the word cheek, you've got ch, e, k. So you've got three phonemes in there because that's three
Hmm.
sounds. You've actually got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 letters, but you've got
Hmm.
three sounds. So that's where the phonemes come in, that you have to help a child learn those letter sounds and the phonemes, which is the blends that they
Hmm.
make, before they can
Hmm.
actually start to work out how this reading and writing thing goes. Now, for some kids, and my daughter was one of them, my daughter's older than my son. Some kids learn to read off cereal packets in the back of the bus. I mean, they just soak it up, no problem at all. But for others, that whole concept of these little squiggly things on a bit of paper actually represent sounds is just really hard. And you do need quite a systematic way of introducing them. I have actually on my website, under the resources tab, I've got a training program for 5 to 7-year-olds, which Professor Gail Gillan at the University of Canterbury here has put together. So that's designed for children who seem to have a spoken language impairment. They've got no problems with intellectual disability, but they've got English as a first language, but they're not picking up those sounds. So you can go on there and it just has little games and things that you can play to help train their ears so they can pick up their sounds. Okay, so that's very new. That's only came out last year that she's devised this
That's
program for 5 to 7-year-olds. Yeah, it wasn't
and
there when
it's
Harry
free,
was
right?
around. Yeah, yeah. You can just go
Yes.
on and
That's
I mean, it's aimed
amazing.
at speech therapists, but I just, you don't have to be
Yes.
a rocket science. You just work your way through it to use it. So you can
Yes.
use that. I used resources from All About Learning. They've got all about spelling, all about reading, and all about math. And it's a systematic way of teaching these things. And it's from a person, well, two people, Orton Gillingham, who devised this
Hmm.
way of teaching people with dyslexia. And it's very
Hmm.
structured. So it just puts one thing in place, you learn that thing, and then you learn the next thing. And it's just a really, for me, it made perfect sense. Harry at school was just being taught with this balanced literacy approach, which again works for maybe 90% of kids, where you
Mhm.
look at the word and you see a picture and you guess what that word might be based on the picture. Well, it was never going to teach him to read and write because it didn't have any logic to it. It didn't make any sense. And he needed a really systematic phonological program to teach him to
Yeah.
read and write. And that's what we did.
Yeah. Orton Gillingham is well known and highly
Mm,
researched for kids with dyslexia, and they need that
yeah,
structured approach so that they only learn one thing at a time. You don't
yeah,
move on until they got that
mm,
one thing. And just going
yeah,
back to the phonemes, it's so important because if you think about like when you said the word cheek, if you didn't hear the E, and how are you going to spell that word if you didn't even know, what vowel it was? You're not.
yeah,
And
yeah,
and so how are you going to when you do sound out that word, how are you going to connect it to the word cheek that just the
yeah,
sound of cheek, and that's the cheek? It's just not ever going to all map together. So
yeah.
um,
Yeah,
it's a
and
really
this
important
there could be
piece.
this speech therapy, auditory processing. There could be things going on that need to be
Hmm.
addressed so they can start to link these sounds to the actual written word. And
Hmm.
certainly for Harry, we did have his auditory processing checked as well, and the speech therapy was actually the thing that made the big difference for him. The speech therapist would put cards down on the floor and he'd have to jump on, what's an A? He had to jump on the A
Uh-huh.
and all that kind of stuff. Just making it really multisensory. Multisensory is
Yes.
the way dyslexic kids learn. That is the approach that works best for a child with dyslexia. Mm.
Yes, because they're getting the auditory, visual, and the kinesthetic. All those pathways in the brain are firing and
Yeah.
helping it stick. Processing speed, I think, is something that many parents might notice but not fully understand. You say it's hard work thinking that hard. How can parents recognize when their child might be struggling with processing speed? And how does that fit into when you're helping him? Like you were talking about the program you use is highly structured and does one thing at a
Mm.
time. I absolutely understand now that that's how that you need to work with a child with dyslexia. A lot of other things in life, you just shove a bunch of things down and it works.
Mhm.
And so you kind of have to flip the script on that a little bit.
Oh, Marie Ripple, who's set up the All About Learning resources for dyslexics, talks about this learning funnel. So you've got like a wide top there, and then you've got quite a narrow bit down there. And like you
Hmm.
say, oh, just shove it all in. Well,
Yeah.
actually, that narrow bit down there is just so narrow, it's not all going to go in.
Yeah.
So it's really important to sort of trickle information in.
Hmm.
If you try and fill anything with a funnel, you realize you've actually got to get the speed just right that it's going to trickle down into that narrow bit. And that's that one thing at a time with lots of repetition, and just not moving ahead until you've actually picked up those concepts. And this is why traditional schooling often is really hard for our kids, because they'll say, oh, well, we taught that on Monday. Well, of course, they've forgotten it by Tuesday or Wednesday. You haven't got it to hope.
Yeah.
And then if you happen to be sick on that Monday, oh, well, it's never going to be even spoken of again because you should have picked it up on that Monday. So it is really difficult
Hmm.
in that sort of school setting where it's one size fits all
Yep.
and you just got to keep up with everybody else.
Right.
So that there is a lot of repetition needed. I talk in the book a wee bit. Again, it's just a visual, silly thing that I made up, but I feel like I've got this mental mattress that other people have got a really nice filing cabinet in their head, and they just flick it open, and it's all perfectly alphabetically ordered and everything. But me, I've just got this mattress, and I just stuff everything underneath it, and it's kind of lumpy and bulgy, and when I need to find something, I have to rummage around and see, well, where is it? And that all takes time because everybody else can just go, oh, yes, it's under A. There it is. Whereas me, I'm
Hmm.
going, oh, it's at the back here. I think I put it in last week. And it takes a long time to remember things. So,
Hmm.
things that you think come on, you should just be able to remember that. Well, it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't work that way because we don't have the same filing system that everybody else has. It's much more chaotic, unfortunately. And I think that's the same for everybody with dyslexia. I don't think it's just me. And there's this thing called processing speed. And I talk about that in the book a wee bit as well. Certainly, Harry, I really notice he's got slow processing speed. And again, people go, oh, well, you're just a bit thick. Well, actually, it's got nothing to do with intelligence. It's
Mm-hmm.
just the fact that you can ask a question and it will take him longer to hear that question, to process that question, and to come out with the answer. The answer's great. There's no problem with the answer, but the processing speed for that is
Mm-hmm.
much slower, and that's just the way it is, really. Um, I do find it really frustrating when people think timed tests are great. You know, let's do a timed spelling test. Let's do a timed
Mm-hmm.
multiplications test. Well, timed testing for kids who've got these processing difficulties, it's just excruciatingly painful. And you're not going to get the best out of someone with dyslexia if you put a stopwatch on them, because that's just not how their brain works.
Yeah, and what's wrong with taking a little more time to think things through? I think
Mm,
that, you know, I think a lot of schools and even society in general values fast talkers and quick thinkers, but there needs to be a space for people who think in a different way and take their time to think through everything and go under their mattress and find the right
yeah,
answer. Yeah, going back to the schools, they in a traditional classroom, they'll maybe teach, you know, either the short A for a week and then they move on where, like you're saying, with dyslexia, you should just stick with that and until you got it because like you're talking about that funnel, you're throwing in it, you're just throwing all this stuff when you go at that speed, and
yeah.
nothing is sticking. It's just a huge waste of time.
And
Um,
the other thing that is so frustrating is when you get sent home a spelling list with about 5 different concepts on that same list.
yes.
You know, if you've got a spelling list, you just want one concept. As you say,
Mhm.
short A. All those words are going to have short A.
Mhm.
Let's not mix it up with 2 or 3 different concepts because
Mhm.
it doesn't help anybody, unfortunately. So that I actually basically got very stroppy and said, look, we are learning spelling at home. He does not need to do spelling tests in school because the spelling tests were so arbitrary and random. It just didn't work for him at all.
Of course not. Yes, I ran into the similar issues where we got the most random list of words of
Mm.
concepts she didn't know at all. No, maybe if it was like short A and then
Mm.
like a sound that she had mastered, like
Yes.
100% new. But when you're throwing in all these random new things that they haven't mastered, um,
Yeah.
it's a huge waste of time. And and you know, when kids with dyslexia, they deal with failure after failure after failure after failure, and it just, snowballs into an avalanche. Um, when you do find the right intervention, it's not that it's too late, but they're just dealing with this avalanche of failure that, how can parents think about like finally finding the right tool, going back and starting from where the child knows, but then they don't even want to try because they've dealt with so much failure. How can a parent think about how to support their child and get them to try again and not be afraid of that failure?
It is a really difficult one. And I think it's important not to put pressure. Pressure is a killer as well.
Uh-huh.
Just to feel under pressure really makes them want to back off. So I don't know. I was fortunate with Harry in that we found the resource all about. We did all about reading first, and then we did all
Mhm.
about spelling. Reading's much easier to learn than spelling.
Mhm.
So we started with level 1, all about reading, and then we moved into spelling once his reading was coming along. But yeah, I hear what you're saying, and sadly, I've been trying to offer support to my niece who's got dyslexia,
Mhm.
um, and I was offering free tuition using the resources that I'd used for Harry, But unfortunately, her parents were saying, "Oh, it's just too hard for us to get her there. She lives 5 minutes round the corner." And I'd said, "Look, I honestly think doing 30 minutes a day before school will just be
Mhm.
able to support her." But they had two other children. Mornings were really busy for them, and they haven't been able to do it. And it's sad because it would make a huge difference to her. I know it would. But life gets in the way sometimes, and we just have to go with what we can do. We don't live in a perfect world, and just offering whatever support we can. Anything will be better
Mhm.
than nothing, basically. And
Yeah.
let's not beat ourselves up by thinking we haven't got the perfect answer. I think
Yes.
the other thing, I don't know if this is the right time to drop this in, but I heard the other day someone say, you'll know your children as adults much more than you'll know them as children. And I just loved that. I just thought, we get so fixated on these first 18 years. Well, actually, we're going to know them so much longer after 18 years. And even in that time after 18 years, they will still be picking stuff up and still be developing. So we don't have to get it all sorted, I don't think. I think just getting that bigger picture every now and again does help to think, yeah, it is hard when a child seems to be resistant to learning and doesn't want to do it. But, that's not the end of the story by a long chalk. Lots of people come back to learning in their 20s or in their 30s even and manage to
Mhm.
do things. So, yeah, I think pressure doesn't help. Pressure on the parents, pressure on the kids. We just have to do what we can and accept that, maybe down the track, other things will come along that'll help. For me,
Mhm.
with Harry, all I wanted him to be able to do was to be functionally literate.
Mhm.
Because if you're not functionally literate, you can't fill in a doctor's form, you can't vote, you can't,
Mhm.
just not to be able to function in society is really,
Mhm.
really hard. And for
Mhm.
me, I just wanted him to reach that level where he was functionally literate,
Mhm.
which I think is only a reading age of about 8, you know.
Mhm.
So you don't have to be the world's best speller or the world's best reader, but you have to be functionally literate. And that's what I was going for. And that's what we achieved and we surpassed it. So, yeah, maybe just keeping those thoughts in mind that
Mhm.
there's plenty of time, even if it's not all happening when they're 6 or 7, there is plenty of time for them to do these things down the track.
That's really beautiful. And I like how you're advising not to put pressure on the kid, but also not to put pressure on yourself as a parent because it is really difficult. And I did want to ask you your perspective because my daughter's 9. I'm all in. I'm making a podcast about dyslexia for goodness sake. So I'm hyper focused on this. I want to make sure that I'm doing the best I can to support her. So now that, Harry is 20, I think you said,
Yeah.
you know, what what advice would you give to yourself when Harry was like 8 or 9, like to have that bigger perspective? Or did you have that already
No,
back
I
then?
didn't. I definitely didn't. And interestingly, we did have a dyslexia tutor for an hour a week, as well as the stuff that I was doing with him.
Mhm.
And one of the tutors did say to me, for boys, their learning really takes off from about 11.
Mhm.
And this was probably when Harry was like 10 or whatever. And she said, so just remember that you're actually dealing with a developing brain as well.
Mhm.
um, I think often as adults, we forget just that level of development that's going on in the brain. And it could be that their brain actually hasn't developed enough
Mhm.
to grasp these concepts. So, again, they might be a little bit slower to have that brain development. It will get there. But
Mhm.
certainly when Harry hit 11, his learning did accelerate. So, if your child is only 8 or 9 or 10, just remember that it could be that their brain hasn't actually reached that level of maturity yet to be able to cope
Mhm.
with those things. And that's why I say throughout the book, it is all about finding things that they are good at, be it
Mhm.
dancing, be it caring for animals, be it sports, be it music, drawing, things that they actually just can do really well and
Mm-hmm.
spending a lot of time focusing on them achieving success in things that they can do. So that keeps their self-esteem up, because self-esteem is the biggie. Um, just feeling that their self-esteem's plummeting is horrible, horrible to see. And certainly once kids hit high school, it just goes next level in terms of trying to keep their self-esteem up. So if they've managed to find things that they are naturally competent in, Harry was great as a goalkeeper. He's actually nearly 7 foot tall, so he's just huge. And he had a very big arm span. So he was the South Island champion goalkeeper. You know, he just could do it because he was so flipping big. He filled the whole goal. Um, and he was also very good at music. So he played the guitar, he played the saxophone, he was in a band. Um, he learnt music just by listening to it at first until he actually got reading under his belt. Then he could read the music, but he was a little bit
Mhm.
slower to actually learn to read music because he couldn't read. But he was very musical right from a young age. So I would say to people who are trying to work with an 8 or 9 year old, just find those things that their child is actually naturally good at. And yes, chip away at these other things,
Mhm.
but really give a lot of praise and a lot of encouragement to things that they are naturally good at. And for Harry, he now works with plants. He doesn't have to write them a letter, and he doesn't have to read anything from them. He just loves plants, and he's a horticulturalist, and he is in his happy place when he's planting trees or pruning a hedge or whatever. And, you know, it's just fantastic to see that uh, he's thriving. He's really thriving.
That's beautiful. I was gonna end by asking you one piece of advice, but I feel like what you just said was so beautiful. I don't want to ruin it. But um, is there anything else, parents in our shoes should be thinking about?
I was just going to say something we talked about earlier is about the fact that as a parent, you have to be the advocate for your child. And that is hard. You know, it is hard because you don't want to be that pushy parent. But at the same time, you do have to realize that nobody else is going to advocate for your child, right? Your child is one of a class of 30. And if you've got a girl, they're probably quite quiet because they're trying to stay under the
Mhm.
radar. It tends to be boys with dyslexia who've also got ADHD, which is what my son had, who get more attention because they're
That's
disrupting the
true.
class. Whereas a quiet girl with dyslexia can just go under the radar, because what she'll do is she'll have coping strategies where she'll be
Mhm.
getting her friends to help her, and she doesn't want to disturb the teacher. And yeah,
Mhm.
so you do actually need to keep an eye on, especially when you've got a quiet girl, what is happening, and be that advocate and finding out what the school can offer, what dyslexic services they actually do have on offer. Working with there might well be a learning support member of staff who is helping all of the kids who've got learning difficulties. So,
Mhm.
really getting on side with them. I think of, and I'm not saying dyslexia is a disability as such, but if my child had diabetes, I wouldn't wait until they had some sort of diabetic coma or something before I went to talk to the
Mhm.
teacher. I would actually go in probably even before the first day of term, or very early on in the term anyway, and have a chat and say, look, these are the things that Harry's been struggling with. This is what his previous teachers have been saying, because you have this idea that, teachers sit down and do a detailed brief on each child. Well, they don't. They haven't got time. So quite often these notes haven't even been passed on to the next year's teacher.
Mhm.
So you do need to go in and explain the things that work. And this is the other thing, actually I find that he can learn best if, he's sitting near the front. He has all of his handouts on cream paper. He doesn't have to copy from the board, all this kind of stuff that works for your child. Spell it out to the teacher, explain what works, and also say, look, more than happy to keep in touch. If you've got any problems, let me know. It would be helpful if we did get some homework accommodation, because homework will take a lot longer for a child with dyslexia. So if the teacher's giving, read a chapter, maybe they only have to read a page. There's this kind of this thing of explaining to the teacher what works for your child and making sure that they know you're really on board and want to partner with them to make it work. So I would say be that child's advocate, really.
I like how you said nobody else is going to be. So it's going to be you. And I think
And don't
educating
feel bad
yourself
about
to,
that. Yeah,
yeah,
you've got to do it.
yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. And like you said, yeah, if it was anything else like diabetes or anything else, you'd be on top of it, and everyone would
yeah,
know what your child needs, and you would be ahead of the curve as much as you possibly can. So
yeah.
I think that's great advice. Um, Thank you for sharing all of this, Beth. Where can people find you online if they want to learn more?
I have got a website, dyslexiaoctopus.com.
Mhm.
And on that, I've got blog posts which talk about various things to do with dyslexia, but also as a parent, how to overcome that anxiety that we have. What
Mhm.
happens when you wake up at 2 a.m, think, well, my child will never survive. And, you do have all these awful things that hit you in the middle of the night. So I've got
Yeah,
lots of blog
that's true.
posts about things like that. I've also got that free resources page, which has got
Yeah.
the various things that'll help. And it's also got the links to the all about learning, all about spelling, all about math sort of sections as well. So that's
Great.
dyslexiaoctopus.com. I have got Instagram and Facebook as well. And yeah, we are putting a wee resource together from this podcast, which talks about the 8 arms of the octopus and just with a little
Yes.
tip for each one. So I'd be very happy for people to get that as well. And hopefully that'll be helpful.
Yeah, and I'll put the link to that in the show notes and the
Thank you.
description so people can go straight there.
My book's called um, Dyslexia Wrestling with an Octopus. And that's available on Amazon. It's also available as an audiobook and an ebook as well. So you can find the link on my website for that.
Awesome. It was a great read, and I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me and answer all these questions. And just like reading your book felt like getting a warm hug from a friend who's gone through all the same hard things I have, I feel like talking to you has felt even more like that.
Thank you. It's been lovely talking.
Thanks for listening. If you like this episode, share it with a friend and be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. You can also follow us on social media for more helpful tips and resources at Dyslexia Made Clear.